All right, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Caroline Fry. I'm the Advocacy and Media Manager at Colorado Common Cause. We do these happy hours on the first Thursday of every month. We've been doing it at the Irish Snug for about a year now. It's a really great space, so we hope to continue doing it here. So thanks so much for coming. Before we get started talking about proportional representation, just a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to have a server coming around and continue taking drink orders. We also have water up here and more food, so please feel free to get up and get more food and drinks. The bathroom is also straight out the door and to the right. So with that, I just want to delve into proportional representation. I tried to cover this. I did, I think, probably a very poor job because it was about a month into my job. And proportional representation is a very heavy subject. I spent about 2 days really delving into it and realized that I needed about 2 months. So I'm really excited to have two experts here to talk about it. We have Thorsten Spain. From the University of Colorado, Denver, with us today. And then we also have Jesse Cumin here, who is with the organization Best Democracy, which I'm sure he'll tell us more about. So without further ado, I would like to go ahead and get started. And just so you know, there's no mic. If you're having a problem hearing, just raise your hand. This is just for a Facebook live stream that we're doing, so you can tell your friends afterward if you like it that you can go on our Facebook page and watch the video. So with that, Thurston, you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. Hi there. Full house. As I was saying earlier, we just need the torches and the pitchforks, and we're ready to go, right? So my job here tonight is to give you a bit of an overview. Give you a bit of an overview about proportional representation, and first past the post, which is of course the system that we have in this country, and then talk about the pros and cons of each. I'd like to start out by talking a little bit about institutions in general, and how that fits with a particular type of institution that we're going to discuss today, which is basically an electoral system. Institutions are rules, right, in the political world. And even though we'd like to believe that we can make the world and remake the world as often as we would like to, it's in the end very sticky. The world is sticky because of these rules. And the rules are created at particular points in time. In political science, we refer to this as critical junctures. And at those points in time, these institutions oftentimes then reflect the distribution of power. So one of the things that we have in the United States, and you know the problem is universal, but in the United States we have had a good run in terms of stability. But that of course produces problems for the stickiness of institutions. Because our institutions are basically pre-modern, they're pre-industrial. Right? So we've got a set of institutions, including the Senate, including the Constitution, that in essence emphasize the importance of rural areas over those of urban or city dwellers. We have a system in place that emphasizes population-less states over those who have more population. Right? And we ultimately have a set of rules that does not or has not taken into account some of these phenomenal changes during the last 150 years, including the full emancipation of African Americans, the equalization of women, right? And of course the rights of workers. Right? So that the majority of people nowadays work for a living in some kind of a cubicle or in some kind of other job, and in essence needs to be protected by law. And this is very difficult in a set of institutions that dates back to a time where property holders had all the power. So in essence, we have a system by which property holders tend to have more of a pull, and that undermines the power of people who work. I'll give you an example. If you'd like to demonstrate in this country, you will have to demonstrate on someone's private property. Right? But the laws will simply not allow you to do that. The police can be used to remove you. In a lot of European countries, organized action like strikes are part of life. it is not just accepted, it is legal for people to not just strike, but to sit on the machinery that they are usually using. Right? That, of course, dramatically improves their power, their bargaining power, versus here, where they bring in the strike breakers and people are screaming in frustration, right? Is basically they're being destroyed day after day when people are coming in and basically doing the work that they used to do. So the interesting thing about institutions is that they're sticky, right? And they're difficult to change. But they're not impossible to change if people want that change to happen. And maybe later on today, well, I know that Jess is going to talk about that, right? So let me talk a bit about electoral systems then. Electoral systems are, in essence, transmission belts between a person, a constituent, and the ultimate representation in Parliament. Right? So it's a set of rules that governs how a vote actually counts. And you can imagine that there are sheer infinite number of ways in which this can be done. And the two primary systems that we'd like to talk about here tonight are first past the post. I'll also refer to as majority system, plurality system, winner-take-all system, right? There are a lot of societies in the world that still have that system. The United States is one. It tends to be an older system. Right? All the European countries used to have that system, and then of course something happened, mainly revolutions. And the first thing that socialist parties did is they instituted proportional representation. Right? Let me say a few things about the first past the post system and then talk about the proportional representation system. So the first past the post system has one person representing a district, and the advantage of that kind of a system is that there is accountability. Accountability between the person who basically represents the district, oftentimes knows a lot of the voters, and then goes to Washington. Right? That's the good thing, is this direct link. The problem with this kind of a link is that the people who are oftentimes elected tend to come from a specific group of people, right? Mainly, they tend to be wealthy. Oftentimes, they are white. Mostly, they are men. If you think about representation in the United States of women in Congress, it's somewhere around 25%, which is unacceptable for a modern democracy. Completely unacceptable, and is one of the reasons for why we have things here that we do not see anywhere else. For instance, there is no paid maternity leave. We know, for instance, we know from medical studies that paid maternity leave increases the chances of the well-being of the infant, right, and the prospects of survival. It is not a huge difference, but it is a difference that is worth talking about. Since we're talking about minor differences in this country, even when we're talking about radon pumps in houses. Those are relatively minor threats, but they are statistically important, and so is paid maternity leave, right? And you can imagine that that would be something that would be passed if we had more women in Congress who would basically push for that, right? Even if guys don't get it. So that the underrepresentation of women is a serious drawback here. A second, and of course that is one of the problems of the first past the post system. Second problem is that all politics is local. So that parties basically try to present plans to districts that make everybody happy, including not paying taxes, right? Not sharing between districts. So it's harder to basically run bigger projects that involve money, taking from wealthy districts, giving to poorer ones. So that's you know, instead of conceptualizing the public as a group of people that are not divided according to districts, but actually divided according to the issues that they're interested in, i.e. environmentalists, or people who would like to promote the rights of women, or who would like to promote the rights of workers. Right? It doesn't really matter where they live, right? In the end, that this is much more of an important issue with which you can galvanize people in a proportional representation system. And then the final thing, and I could say more, but I'm already seeing I'm running out of time here, is that, of course, the tremendous loss of votes or wasted votes, right? And that comes in two ways. The first is, of course, it's first past the post, one side wins. And in a two-party system, this is particularly bad. because you can win by a few hundred votes in some cases. I've seen 10 votes, right? Which is why we have these recounts, and the other votes don't count, right? They're not countable, right? In this system, and that's a huge problem. And because they're not countable, that gets to a final problem, and that is voter apathy. Why would anyone vote in a blue state, or a red state, or a red district, or a blue district, right? If you know that it always turns that way. From an economic point of view, rational choice kind of point of view, it makes no sense for people to stand in line, other than, you know, civic duty. But most of us have other things to do also, right? So we're going to make some decisions about where we spend our time, right? So that's first past the post. Let me turn to proportional representation. So here we have a system where there are several people representing the district, and how many is different from country to country. And that, and of course, the ultimate representation of people in parliament is very close to how people actually voted. In this kind of a system, you count almost every vote, right? Not all the votes, because one of the things, even though parties are represented proportionally to how people actually voted, so 30% voted for this party, that party gets 30% representation, there are usually hurdles put in place. They go anywhere from 2 to 9, I've seen, right? Meaning you want to make sure that a party that runs on something substantial and gets a certain amount of a widespread support, instead of a fringe party that comes in and potentially does something damaging. So a lot of systems does have these thresholds, right? I remember the first free elections in Russia. Those were actually free compared to what we're looking at now. They had a beer drinkers party, right? So they're cheers. So maybe not the worst of all the parties, right? We've heard worse. But the point is that you kind of want to make sure that there's a certain threshold before these people are let in. Let me talk, because I'm running out of time, about the advantages of such a system. All right, so if a party now tries to grab votes from across the country and gets representation, even if it doesn't get the majority somewhere, it can, this changes everything, right? All of a sudden, it's no longer the district that is important. It's no longer even the state. It is now about an entire group of people. So a party is going to find a group of people that it proposes some issues for. So, for instance, environmental, a green party, right? Or a party that advances the rights of workers or women, or, of course, small entrepreneurs, what have you. And that party then tries to advance the issues of those groups. And the first thing that you notice about this kind of a system is that people are actually talking about issues. Because now, in order to get someone to be on your side, you actually have to discuss something with them instead of saying just, oh, I'm a really nice guy, you could have coffee with me. You know, I'm a likable person, and that person is not. I don't have coffee with him. Right? So that we're talking much more about what should be done. So in a proportional representation system, the discourse is much more informed, because we're actually dealing with a lot more of the nitty-gritties of how something should be done. The other thing about a proportional representation system is, because the party is trying to grab as many other people, as many voters as possible, and because they have several representatives, they will try to offer an attractive package to the voter. And that will include a woman, right? That might include someone from a minority residing in that particular district. It might even be the first person on the list, because the way this works is that the parties create lists, and if the percentage is adequate, then these lists are filled with name after name, right? There are open lists also where people can decide more, but in most systems of the world, they're closed. The party will determine who is on the list, and in fact, people vote for the parties, which is another way of holding, or is a particular way of holding people accountable, because people vote for a party and for an ideology and expect that party to do that kind of stuff. And if they don't Like if the Green Party suddenly says, you know what, nuclear energy isn't that bad, right? Let's do nuclear. All of a sudden, there'll be, you know, a storm. And next moment, before they realize it, they'll no longer be represented. Remember the threshold, right? Suddenly, and this has actually happened to the Green Party. So it holds parties accountable. They cannot just escape in, or sometimes they will try to escape into the personality thing, right? Sometimes a politician will be known and will try to also show off the, you know, that personality trump card. But for the most part, these parties really are judged by what they do for their group of people. Final thing on this: tremendous differences we see between countries that have first past the post and the proportional representation. The UN has several indexes on how human life is measured. The Human Development Index, for instance, consistently ranks countries higher with proportional representation. So the things that are in that index are things like criminal behavior, prosperity, equality, distribution of wealth, right? Educational levels. There's a lot of stuff in those indexes. But the reason those countries score better is because the ultimate result of proportional representation is a more adequate representation of all of us and our diversity, so that there will be more women in parliament. There will be more minorities in parliament. And the result will be a more benign government, a more helpful government, and a less cruel government, right? So as a result of this, we see those tremendous differences between not just the systems itself, but the outcome, the eventual outcome of these types of systems. I think I've said a lot, but and I'd like to open it up later on then for discussion.
Great. Flip that on here if you would like me to.
Sure. You'll probably have to re-aim, Margaret.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jesse Kumin, and a couple of years ago I started a little group. It's only on Facebook right now. We're going to expand. It's called Best Democracy, and Best Democracy came out of frustration with the city of Boulder. I found out that City of Boulder had one small group of 300 people who had won every single election since 1975. And I was wondering, like, how is it that they are able to win every single election? And it was just several years after the Gore versus Bush debacle in Florida, with the Electoral College issue. In 2003, there was a Boulder City election where there were 7 open seats. Normally there are 5. And a couple of resignations had happened. And this one group, and I'll give them a name, Plan Boulder. Plan Boulder won all 7 seats. And I was wondering, how do they win all 7 seats? So I started looking into it. And it turned out that Boulder is using an at-large system that is designed to diminish minority representation. And so I started learning about all these different election systems, and that you can design an election system basically to get the kind of results that you want. So this, I traced it back to the Constitutional Convention. And what they did at the Constitutional Convention was you had a bunch of wealthy white guys, the majority of whom owned slaves, and they designed a system where you had to be a wealthy white guy who owned property in order to vote over the age of 25. And what they had done is voter suppression to the tune of 94%. That's from the National Archives. So you have 94% voter suppression. So in the course of doing this research, I'm not an academic, but I try. And so what I found out is if you can design a system, who can vote, who they can vote for, how the votes are counted, and how people vote, you can pretty much predetermine what the results are going to be. So we've got a system that's designed to give us really only two choices. And so there, in the course of looking at things, you find out about how people are doing things in other parts of the world. And I found out 21 of 28 EU countries, European Union countries, are using one form or another of proportional representation. And over 90 countries in the world are using proportional representation. And nobody is copying the United States with good reason, because our system really isn't designed to represent people. So there, in the course of research, I ran across a book. It's called A Beautiful Question. I don't know if anybody here has heard of that or not. And the idea with A Beautiful Question is that if you ask a question correctly, you can get at the core of what an issue is. And so what I was thinking is the original question that the founding fathers used was, how can we design a system that works really well for us and will keep us in power in perpetuity? And so they designed a system where they would control the U.S. Senate, all the power would reside in the Senate, and they would, the senators were selected by state governments. They weren't directly elected until 1917. And they came up with all of these different ways to essentially have a small, elite, white ruling class. And that, it's not terribly representative. They put in Article 5 of the Constitution, which is designed to obstruct change. They wanted to prevent the abolition of slavery from ever happening. So the United States had slavery for 93 years after England abolished slavery. We have all of these systems in place to essentially guide the direction of how the country works out and to restrict change. So with the beauty with proportional representation is that there's lots of choice. It's more flexible. Everybody is included at the table. Great quote from Elizabeth Warren: if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. And you know, the best example of that were at the Constitutional Convention, there were no slaves at the table. And 18% of the U.S. population ended up in permanent slavery and treated worse than farm animals. So you have, we're in a situation today that's basically a designed result that's a remnant of this system that was constructed 230 years ago. And as Thorsten said, it's an archaic system. And so my feeling is, if a previous generation hands us a really awful situation, we don't have to accept that. And it's our responsibility to take control for our own destiny, be masters of our own destiny, and change the sandwich that we were handed to the sandwich that we want. And I didn't say the mirrored sandwich, okay? But anyhow, we can do that. And the way to do that is following Martin Luther King's 5-step process that he used to abolish Jim Crow. And I figure if we can come up with a better system, I'm glad to hear of it. Anybody who can accomplish getting rid of 100 years of Jim Crow, that's a pretty good system, a formula to do it. So the way he did it is first you observe what the problems are, you observe that they exist, then you try to understand what the historical roots are and why they persist, then you come up with solutions, and the best solution is proportional representation. And the fourth step is getting people's attention, which is, hopefully we've got your attention today. And the fifth step is implementing changes into law. So the system is that we have with first past the post and single winner districts is so entrenched that it's going to be incredibly difficult to get rid of. And the way to do it is to approach it in bite-sized pieces. So what I'm proposing, and I don't know if everybody got a copy or not, I have a little booklet here. It's called the Boulder Plan. And it says Boulder on it. I just want to emphasize on the last page, there's a table. You can scale Boulder to any city, up or down, smaller or larger. The formula works. All the concepts in there can be extrapolated out to work for your town. I feel that Boulder is the low-hanging fruit because we have a really corrupt system. We only have one-party rule. And we have relatively educated populace that hopefully wouldn't be as resistant to change. So before you go, you should get a copy of the Boulder Plan, bring it home, take a look at it. So if we prototype the proportional representation systems that are already in use in Europe and Australia and New Zealand, all 5 of the top 5 countries in the democracy index all use proportional representation. If we prototype that in a city in the United States, then people have something to look at that's tangible. And generally people fear things they don't understand. And if you make it tangible, you make it something that they can get their minds around, then that's something that they can start to accept. So we need to start it by starting small in local government and implementing it in local government. Then hopefully we can bring it to the state of Colorado. And like with the marijuana laws, we can, people will copy us because we're so good on that. And what else? I want to bring up one other thing. Caroline asked me to bring this up. Caroline, I'm sorry. What it is, that there was a proposal brought up last week in Congress by Representative Don Beyer, 8th District of Virginia, and it's called the Fair Representation Act. And what he did is he brought up a proportional representation system that would have 3 members per district. And it's a really good step, first step, in the sense that they're introducing the idea of proportional representation to the U.S., but it's not fine-grained proportional representation. So I want to draw the distinction on this. Under their system, that he's proposing, there are 3 representatives per district. You need to have 25% of the vote in order to have your party member elected. And the systems that are in use in Europe mostly are anywhere from 2 to, what did you say, 9%? Thorsten? 9%. So depending on what the threshold is for having representation, you have fewer or greater number of parties. So if you have a really low threshold for representation, you tend to have more parties. And a good example is Denmark, where they have a 2% threshold, in order to be elected to parliament. They call it Folketing, and they have 9 parties. And Norway has a 4% threshold. They have 8 parties. Germany has a 5% threshold. Currently, they have 5 parties. And Israel's got 10 parties. Sweden has, I think, 10 parties. So depending on how you design the system, you can get a particular result. And what I'm promoting in my Boulder plan is that we copy the Danish system. And what they do is they elect 3/4 of their members from districts that have average 13.5 members per district. So you have a lot of members per district, lots of choice. You're going to find somebody who pretty much represents you. Under the system, this Fair Representation Act, it's harder to find a group that represents your point of view when there are probably only going to be 3 parties. So I'm suggesting that more parties are better, but you can't go too far. What did you say? Italy has 20? You can go too far and get lots of splinter parties. So there's a happy medium in there someplace. I think Norway has it with the 4% threshold. So 8 parties, lots of choice. They form governing coalitions. Those governing coalitions will work together to pass legislation that's amenable to all of them. It fosters cooperation, civility. They're not screaming at each other. They're not calling everybody else dirty names. They work together, and it's a much more civil system.
Let's go ahead and open it up to Q&A then. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Because I'm holding the mic, I get to start the Q&A. You guys talked a lot about. Do you want to go ahead and stand up as well? You all talked a lot about the benefits of PR, proportional representation. What are some of the downsides of proportional representation?
I'll let you take that.
Well, especially in the traditional party list system, the downside of proportional representation is the fact that the link between the constituent and Parliament is through the party. And the party is very powerful in this, right? Especially when it comes to the naming of the candidates. And a lot of these systems are closed lists. So basically individuals do not have much of a choice. They just have to vote for the party. And this is particularly a problem in more modern times, our times, when we are all breaking away from the traditional party affiliations. So we can't just say, okay, my dad was blue collar, I am blue collar, I'm going to work Social Democrat. More and more people are like issue oriented, and they're changing their mind more quickly. And I think that's one of the reasons for why parties are losing support in all systems, not just here in the United States, but we see this in Europe. Some of you have probably seen the recent French elections, which is a complete destruction of the traditional party system there, right? So that the link is not perfect, right? And the second problem with the proportional representation system is, since the party is so important, the district matters don't impact the party as much as they should. Now, there have been some attempts to fix that problem. The so-called mixed member proportional representation system, electoral system, right? That's a mouthful. Is one attempt to fix this problem. Germany has the system. Venezuela does, and there are some countries that have instituted over the last 2 decades. Germany instituted this after World War II, and the attempt was to mix first past the post with the advantages of proportional representation. So in that system, half of all the representatives are actually elected in the first past the post system and directly represent the district. So they then go to Berlin and they represent their district. The other half is elected by a second vote. So people have two votes, one for that first person. The second vote goes to the party. And the party then determines who else gets sent to the capital. And then it gets more complicated than that. Very complicated, but Germany, right? What can you say? It was almost laughable that this complicated system was a few years ago overturned by the Constitutional Court, who made it more complicated, right? So, because what happens in the German system is because the first vote is so important, if the second vote does not yield the same result for the party as for the individual, let's say a party gets 8 seats in a German state, but in the first vote, but doesn't get that in the second vote, then they basically compensate. So the first thing that happens before a German parliament meets, everybody laughs about this, is a construction crew comes in and puts in new seats, right? Because there's new because if you compensate, then in essence the number of people in parliament constantly changes, right? And so the Supreme Court then found a few years ago that that's actually not fair unless everybody gets rewarded, because the proportion has to be the same. So now there's compensation on compensation. And I don't want to bother you with that, right? But the interesting thing is that there have been attempts, and that's what I'm trying to get at, to solve this problem of getting someone who's really committed to the district, who shows up in the district, and also getting people to talk about issues that are made more intelligent by ideology and parties. Because parties offer us different ideas of how to address certain problems. Right, and they take us away from this. I believe it's a trap, the personality trap, that somebody smiles at us, promises us all sorts of things, but doesn't deliver because they don't have to. Hey, they're just nice, right? But in the end, we would like them to do something, and a lot of problems are addressed very differently depending on what ideology you choose, left, right, center, right? And in that way, the party is helpful. But to wrap it up. The problem with the proportional representation system, particularly in its pure form, is that the link is to the party, and the party might decide to do other things. Things that are not necessarily that good for a particular district. They're okay for the entire group of people, but not so much for a particular district, right? And oftentimes these folks don't show up, right? They just basically spend most of their time in the capital, and they do what the party wants them to do. They vote with the party at all times. Call this block voting, party discipline, right? So we need a link to the voter, to the district. And that is the big problem with proportional representation. Long answer.
So do you think that the German system is better because it compensates, or even though it's more complicated, do you prefer it?
Yeah, I think that there is a slight trend developing to institute this. Right? Because people like that link. They would like to have a phone number of someone they can call and say, this is the person who is responsible for me, right? There is another advantage to the mixed member proportional representation system, and that is that if you run as an independent, you can still come through, right? You will be elected even though your party may not be elected, because your party still has to meet, in Germany it's a 5% threshold. Right? So if you don't make that threshold, your party will not be represented, but you can be, even if you're an independent. Right? So there are a number of interesting things that, I admit it's very complicated, right? But let the machines take care of that, right? We got computing, power to do that. So I think it is a step in the right direction, but it is complicated, right? Just saying, there are these two principles: accountability, linking the district with the center of power, and also counting all the votes and being a fair representation of how people actually voted. Yeah.
Dr. Shane, I deduced this, and I've been telling this, but I realized I don't know if it's actually true. So I think in a popular vote in some area, that a two-party system might not come up with many policy decisions that are different. The Democrats will look at the entire, through voting, through polling or whatever, and will try to design a platform that appeals to 51% of the group. If I had proportional representation, I might be a Green. My Greens might join a coalition, and the coalition that makes up 50%, 1% of the vote, will come up with will wheel and deal and argue and come up with a platform that also appeals to that same 51%. So the difference might not. I think that actually the two-party system may be conducting this kind of weighing of voter preferences, but not through the vote, but maybe through a kind of guessing or polls or something. I just don't see it happening, but maybe it is happening.
I think that some of this is definitely happening, right? But I would argue then that in the end the voter is better off if they know that, let's say, the Green Party goes into a coalition with the Social Democratic Party. We all kind of know where they come from, and now they negotiate about who gets what ministerial post. You could imagine the Green Party wants the environment, right? And it's all very much open. It's open for discussion. Whereas I don't think we necessarily have that in a two-party system. It all converges towards like, we'll do everything for you, right? Okay. And the differences are, you know, like the Republican Party is not the first party on the list when it comes to the environment. They stand for things more like drill, baby, drill, right, that kind of stuff. But they will have the environment as part of their platform, right? So it can get really confusing. But all of us know what a Green Party does, or at least is supposed to do, right? They're supposed to do something for the environment. And so we can judge them by that if they fail to do that. And that's much harder to judge a large party, right?
But my frustration with the eventual outcome might not be any better. I remember Colin told us as a student that somebody shot the MOP of the Greens with a paint gun on the steps of the Reichstag because he dared compromise, and his own party constituents were so disgusted with his, now that he actually had some power, had to make a deal, that they mock executed him. And that mirrors the frustration I might feel in the system we have now. Like, I don't know that if the issue is make everybody happy, then I don't see either. Then is one system better than the other?
That was a tough question.
The answer is yes.
No, I think that in the proportional representation system, and one thing I neglected to say is that we seem that there is a law called Duverger's law, basically kind of tries to link a first-past-the-post system to a two-party system, right? So that the two are linked as much as a proportional representation system is linked to a multi-party system. So that one of the benefits that I forgot to mention is that in a proportional representation system, we will then get eventually a multi-party system because people vote finally for what they want. They won't just vote around the back and say, okay, I really want to vote far left, but there's only one party that does it. I mean, there's probably 5 communists somewhere, but there's no chance, right? So I have to pick the thing that can actually win. In a multi-party system, people can, do what Americans like to do, which is go into the grocery store and find 10,000 types of cereal, right? And it's interesting that we don't demand that from our political system. So back to your question, I think it is clear to have these different parties offer different solutions and put them on the table. It is better than having two large amalgamous types of masses that are both trying to grab the center and stand for everything and nothing, right? Is that what your opinion too?
Yeah, I'd like to comment. They're not trying to grab the center. Two major parties are authoritarian right. They don't really represent. There's a whole spectrum of political discourse that does not exist in this country.
Yeah.
That's correct. Yes.
Can I hijack this to ask a question?
Yeah, and I don't want. Please take the next one.
Sure.
I think it's a great idea.
Municipalities in Colorado, if I'm not mistaken, all of the municipal elections here are nonpartisan. Is that correct? Or is there a way that a home rule city can get around that? Because I think state law dictates that there must be no parks.
The home rule versus statutory rule cities, there are all sorts of hurdles for statutory cities in order to be able to conduct certain types of elections. And the same thing is true for counties. They're particularly hamstrung. And so there are a number of hurdles that have to be jumped before we can even start implementing this. But what we're talking about can be brought into home rule cities that are already home rule cities. And there are a couple features of PR that will not translate easily. The state doesn't, I believe, has rules about parties running in municipal elections, and they also want all the municipal elections to be in odd years. So what happens with odd year elections is only half as many people show up. So it's another form of voter suppression. If you want to get the same kind of numbers that they have in Europe and New Zealand and other PR countries, you have to have, you need to get as many of the hurdles out of the way as possible. So they've got roughly 75, 80, up to 90% in Australia of the people who are voting. They also use mandatory voting in Australia.
They charge you if you don't vote.
Right.
So I think you had a question.
So I'm sorry.
Would it be better to try to amend the Colorado Constitution to move from first past the post to approval voting by a plebiscite or by maybe getting a majority of, you know, assume Democrats that are willing to, you know, in the name of good government change, pass a resolution?
Jonathan Singer, maybe Frank, do you want to take this one? Jonathan's.
Not really, I trust you.
Okay. Jonathan Singer sponsored legislation in the last legislative session to remove some of the roadblocks for approval voting. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Enabling legislation for the Secretary of State. Enabling legislation for the Secretary of State to write instructions for statutory municipalities and special districts to use approval voting if they wanted to.
There you have it. And so,
My feeling on the two-party system, what I don't like about it is it's a win-lose. You know, I don't see this coming to the center. I see this as a win-lose. Yeah, the other question.
Let me, if I could, for clarification's sake, do you mean the policy that are made or the whole election process?
The policies.
Okay.
You have two people running. Okay, one person gets the seat, the other person loses. You have a policy. Well, whatever policy is voted in, the other policy loses.
It's true, but I would slightly disagree with your point that a lot of the policies still tend to be very similar. I think the problem with the two-party system is more that we don't really have true choices. Since both parties are offering everything, we don't really know what they're going to do. Right? In essence, we cannot distinguish them and we cannot hold them accountable. Right? So that is why it's then so easy at the end of something to deny, you know, what is the new world we're in, false alternative facts, right? It's so easy to do that kind of stuff because we don't even know what somebody promised, let alone what they were going to do, right? That was different from the other party. They all kind of promised the same stuff. Sometimes there are some issues when it comes to civil liberties, right?
Or healthcare.
And healthcare.
One side here, one side there, nobody's talking about.
It is true. It is rare though, right? If we're looking at a lot of these policies, they tend to be closely clustered in the center. But is the one? is that your name?
Yes.
Can I see that right? As you pointed out, that we are actually even missing a big part of the ideological spectrum in this country. Like, you know, with Bernie and people finally identifying him as a social democrat, that was, I guess, the term social was enough to, right? So that we're missing a lot of the more left side here in this country. Because it's basically liberals, right? We have mostly liberals here, conservative liberals and more progressive liberals. Yes, kind of.
So basically, most of our political discourse, it's confined to this top right-hand corner.
Ah, yeah, yeah.
Except the media and our two major parties tell you basically all solutions to what else can be found within that tiny little box, patently true. If you look at other countries' parties, this is spread out all over the place. So our political discourse here is without comparison.
If I could add one sentence to that, I'm writing a book right now on German foreign policy, and one of the things that I am working on and analyzing is the discourse in German parliament. And Germany has a communist party. It's a reformed communist party, and a lot of people will say, oh, it's, you know, it's a leftover from the totalitarian past. It's a horrible party, all that kind of stuff. But the interesting thing is, they do have their time. They do talk. And as they talk, they do, you know, as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, wow, they do have a point, right? So just that, what I guess what I'm trying to say is not having someone there who makes that point makes us all poor. We're not as well off because, for instance, communists tend to be totally anti-war. Right? They tend to ask very tough questions about why countries are intervening. And if you look at some of the things that determine intervention abroad by this country, you do question some of these motivations, right? I mean, we still don't have a good explanation for what happened in Iraq. I mean, I haven't seen one, right? So we kind of need that part of the spectrum that asks critical questions, even if they're uncomfortable, right?
The other question I have is, okay, I go into the voting booth. What is my ballot going to look like? Is it just list parties? Is it going to list people? You know, okay, this party is going to put, you know, 4 candidates up. And also, where would I go to research any of the candidates that the party may put up?
Well, these folks will campaign, right? They will come by, they will talk to you, but your biggest link will be with the party, its ideology and its platform. And they're supposed to be committed to that, right? And that is actually also easy for you, because you can basically figure out what they stand for, right? And they will put out posters, they'll inform you as to what they have in mind, right?
Yeah, but when I go into the voting booth, am I just going to have, you know, 5 parties?
Do you vote for a person or a party?
Like I said, there are different versions of proportional representation. Some are, Wish and I just talked about that, right? There is a ranked version where you can actually rank the candidates. There are also closed lists where you cannot do anything. You will see the names, but you can't really influence it, right? And they fill up depending on how many votes the party gets. But there's a lot of creative work done out there, right? There's a lot of options here by which we can find a perfect system. It seems to me the bigger problem here tonight, and generally, is how to get away from the old system, period. Right? It's not so. I think there's no shortage of ideas as to what we could try to do, and we have learned so much in the last 200 years, right, about how we can better represent people. Right? The biggest problem is how do we get past the stickiness of institutions. Think about how incredibly difficult it is to pass an amendment. That the Equal Rights Amendment was never passed. Right? Right? How do we get there? That's to me, you know, once we get to that next hurdle, right, then we can start to think about design, because we know we can probably improve it just by we've learned a lot, right?
We have time for about one more question. Does someone have a very pressing question? If not, ask you. Go ahead.
Hey, hi. I was wondering how if there's a way to design a system of proportional representation that avoids the strange bedfellows kind of coalition like we're having in the UK right now, where somebody wins most of the votes and just because they want to keep power, they make a coalition with someone who pretty much everybody else votes.
Like a fringe party,
Right.
From what else in this case, right?
And probably the power of the main party votes as well, if they want to stay in power.
Yeah. I'm going to have to think about that, right? Remember, we are in a democratic system, and democracies have certain processes with uncertain outcomes, right? And we cannot tell people what to do. And you can find the good in the bad. Like, for instance, if a major party finds a smaller party to work with that is more extreme, we could argue that over time maybe the smaller party develops an appetite in ruling and begins to moderate its policy stances. I've seen some of this happening in Italy, which used to have a bunch of neo-fascist types of parties that have mellowed out quite a bit, right? So it's a mixed kind of bag, because if you look at Israel, here we have a problem that some of these more extremist parties tend to oftentimes determine policy, right? And they don't seem to be changing. But again, it's democracy. We cannot control everything, right? In the end, we have to rely on the institutions as preserving our liberty, less so than the people who take control of them, right? So it's what Jesse said. It's about the design, right? It is about the design, but in a positive way. But before we get there, I think we need to figure out how to get to the ability to make the design, change the design, right? Which I think is very difficult in the United States. And if anyone has an idea about how we should go about that, short of the pitchforks and torches, then I'd like to open it up for everyone. What's that?
State by state.
State by state, right? That's city by city, state by state. I agree with you, right? Jesse, you have a plan, right?
Right. It's a Boulder plan. So what I did is I looked at all these different systems, and you can predict what the results are going to be based on the design of the system. So the system that I ended up liking the most was Denmark. They have 3/4 of their legislature, the Folketing, is selected by district. They have 13.5 members per district. And every demographic slice of Denmark is represented down to 2% of the population. So if you can get 2% of your neighbors to agree on a particular platform, you can have a representative. And they have 10 districts with averaging 13.5 members each. 9 parties. It comes up with 9 parties. For the model for Boulder, I picked Helsingborg, Sweden. Helsingborg, Sweden also has 7 parties for a city of 130,000 people. So you can cherry pick the different features that you like from different systems. He mentioned, Thorsten mentioned several times about party lists. You can have a closed party list where the party has all the power to put whoever's going to be running on their party. But you can also have what are called open party lists. And an open party list, they'll run a number of people in every district, and people can order the list any way that they want by voting for the individual inside that list. And then there's another component to this, which is 1/4 of the legislature is selected at large. And those at-large members are coming from the people that are not elected directly on the district representation. So you can have what's called a near winner system, where to adjust the actual outcome in the parliament, a party might have 14% of the parliamentary members that they won in district elections, but they actually got 17% of the vote, and they'll pick another 3 people or 3% of the members of parliament from their party list based on how many votes they got. So the beauty of the system is it's completely inclusive. Everywhere in the country, every district, everyone's vote counts. Whereas, as you mentioned before, let's say if you're a Democrat in Texas or a Republican in California, a lot of places your vote doesn't count, and there's no reason to vote. So this last election, 54.5% of the people voted, but that means 44.5% didn't vote. And people aren't engaged because they're not included. Their vote doesn't really count. So if you have a system where every single vote counts, you have a lot of choice. You have it eliminates gerrymandering. We didn't talk very much about gerrymandering.
We're going to have, in the future, this year we are going to have a happy hour on gerrymandering. So I think we should probably leave it at that. I want to respect both of your time.
Right. So there's absolutely no gerrymandering under this system. It's impossible to draw a district where people get excluded. And I'm sorry, so I should wind it up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Are we good?
yes,
Okay.
we're good. Thank you all. All right, George and Jesse, thank you so much for coming in. Really great discussion. Couple of things to wrap up. First of all, I always think it's really nice in these kind of situations where you don't really know each other to introduce yourself to the people at your table and say why you came here and what you're interested in terms of PR or other representation. So please just introduce yourself to your neighbor on your way out. Second, how many people have heard of the American Legislative Exchange Council? Alec? So for people who do not know, they are a pretty terrible organization that brings together corporate lobbyists and state legislators from around the country to create legislation behind closed doors with no public input that they then take home to their home states and introduce, which create very, very terrible laws that beat back labor laws and environmental laws that have to do with climate change and whatnot. So they're actually coming to Denver and having their meeting on July 15th. July 19th through 21st. So we are having a teach-in here in Denver on Saturday, July 15th from 10 until 2. We would love for you to come and learn more about how ALEC has negatively impacted a variety of different issues, and specifically in Colorado as well. So there's more information. I will give you a flyer on your way out. I also would love for you to sign in if you have not already. And then lastly, again, plugging the happy hours. We have these on the first Thursday of each month. And it's kind of just a good way to get together and talk about an interesting topic of conversation and meet like-minded people. So thank you so much for coming. And I will send you an email with more information with maybe Twitter handles and other ways that you can kind of get plugged into what they're doing. So thank you again so much for coming.
Thank you.